Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Between 1978 and 1994, the strangled bodies of 6 women were discovered in remote areas around Indianapolis, Indiana. These weren't high-profile cases at the time, and the perpetrator managed to evade capture for decades. Unlike other well-known killers whose crimes made headlines, this case remained mostly hidden from public view until the late 2000s, when advances in DNA technology finally exposed the perpetrator's identity. What makes this case especially chilling isn't just the brutality of the murders, it's the way the killer blended into the community. People described him as polite, dependable, and trustworthy, the kind of man who could be counted on to help neighbors or colleagues without complaint. And yet, beneath that carefully maintained facade lurked a calculated predator. The first victim was Janice L. Harper. She had recently left her small hometown near Indianapolis, seeking work and independence in the city. On March 12, 1978, her body was found by a jogger in a wooded area on the outskirts of the city. She had been strangled, her clothing disheveled, and her personal belongings scattered nearby. Janice's disappearance had initially gone unnoticed. Her family had assumed she was busy with friends or work. It wasn't until days later that the police even began a serious investigation. Janice's mother, Eleanor Harper, never fully recovered from the loss. She spent years trying to understand what had happened to her daughter, often staying awake at night imagining the details. Eleanor refused to believe her daughter had wandered into danger by chance. She sensed someone had intentionally targeted Janice. The second victim was 16-year-old Tamra, or Tammy, Clayton, a girl from a neighboring town. She had run away from home, struggling with a fractured family life and seeking freedom on the streets. Tammy was discovered on November 3, 1980, in an abandoned warehouse along the riverfront. Wire had been used to bind her wrists and neck. Her death, like Janice's, was ruled a homicide by strangulation. The local police investigated, but with few leads and no witnesses, the case quickly went cold. By 1982, a pattern was emerging. Another young woman, 17-year-old Margaret J. Daniels, was found in a vacant lot near the outskirts of downtown. She, too, had been strangled, and personal items from her purse were missing. She had been trying to survive on her own after leaving home and working odd jobs to support herself. Margaret's disappearance had been reported late, as her family assumed she had simply gone out with friends, giving the killer yet another window of opportunity. The fourth victim, Catherine M. Benson, was slightly older at 25, and unlike the previous victims, she had not been a runaway. Catherine struggled with mental health issues and occasionally relied on strangers for help when navigating the streets. On February 14, 1985, she was found in a derelict building. A nylon stocking had been tied around her neck, and she clearly resisted. Police ruled her death a homicide, but once again they struggled to connect her case to the earlier murders. In the summer of 1986, the fifth victim, Naomi R. Kelly, a 23-year-old single mother, was discovered in a rundown park. Naomi had been juggling school and childcare, trying to build a better life for herself and her 2 children. A towel was found wrapped around her neck and face, and an autopsy confirmed she had been strangled. At the time, authorities considered the possibility that her death might be linked to her work with a local bar, but no further investigation took place. The sixth victim, Deborah L. Benson, was 34 and had struggled with drug addiction. She was found naked except for a pair of socks, dumped outside a shuttered community center in late 1986. She left behind a young daughter. Police initially assumed her death was connected to her lifestyle and focused less on identifying a potential serial killer, allowing the perpetrator to slip through the cracks yet again. These cases shared a haunting similarity. The victims were all women on the margins of society. Many were young, vulnerable, or isolated, making them easy targets for someone familiar with their routines. And in each case, the method was the same: strangulation with stockings, shoelaces, or wire. The locations were isolated, far enough from the city that someone could commit the crime and disappear without being noticed. The man behind these killings was Ronald J. Bishop, a sanitation worker for the city who had managed to cultivate an image of reliability and trust. His co-workers described him as always willing to help, smiling at everyone, and dedicated to his job. He had been working in the sanitation department since the late 1970s and had even moved up to supervising a team of drivers and maintenance staff. Few could have suspected that behind that friendly demeanor lay a history of violent assaults and abuse. Bishop's early years were marked by aggression. He was the eldest of 6 siblings and often used his physical strength to intimidate both classmates and younger children. He skipped school regularly and eventually dropped out in 10th grade. By his early 20s, he had already been involved in multiple assaults and sexual offenses, but he repeatedly avoided serious consequences due to lack of evidence, victims retracting statements, or plea bargains. In 1969, he married his first wife, Linda, who became pregnant shortly after their wedding. Their marriage was turbulent. She later reported repeated physical and sexual abuse. Yet he was able to walk free, facing only a minimal fine and divorce proceedings. Over the next decade, Bishop would continue this pattern, assaulting women, sometimes minors, yet evading serious punishment. His reputation in the community remained surprisingly intact, a chilling reminder of how easily appearances can be deceiving. By the late 1970s, Bishop had married again, his third marriage beginning in 1978. Despite a documented history of aggression, he maintained the facade of a hard-working, reliable man. He continued targeting women, many of them vulnerable, and law enforcement repeatedly failed to stop him. Arrests for assaults, sexual misconduct, and harassment often ended with either charges dropped or minimal consequences. Victims were left traumatized, some relocating to avoid further contact, while the system failed to protect them. In 1986, Bishop began working as a sanitation worker at Midland Waste Management, rising quickly to a supervisory role. With access to city streets and private properties, he had a level of mobility that allowed him to identify potential victims while maintaining the appearance of a normal life. This position, combined with his history of avoiding legal repercussions, emboldened him to continue. Throughout the 1980s, Bishop remained active in the community. He volunteered occasionally at local schools and charities, furthering the illusion of normalcy. Neighbors and co-workers had no reason to suspect that someone so ingrained in the community could be responsible for the mysterious deaths of young women across Indianapolis. But as DNA technology advanced in the 2000s, evidence from old cases began to point directly at him, confirming suspicions that many had feared but never voiced. The police at the time had been slow to connect the dots between victims. Each death was initially treated as isolated incidents: a missing runaway, a woman living on the streets, someone involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. Bias and assumptions allowed Bishop to continue preying on women without immediate scrutiny. In retrospect, patterns in the crimes were striking. Locations, victim profiles, and the method of killing suggested a single perpetrator, a predator carefully choosing victims who were unlikely to be missed or investigated thoroughly. By the mid-1990s, Bishop had largely disappeared from public attention. He avoided further crimes, at least publicly, and continued working in sanitation, maintaining his image as a dependable, ordinary man. It would take nearly a decade before the first breakthrough would finally put him in the crosshairs of justice. In 2001, the Indianapolis Police Department received federal funding to re-examine cold cases using DNA profiling. Samples collected from crime scenes decades earlier, once considered useless, were tested against newly established DNA databases. Among these was a sample from the 1986 murder of Naomi Kelly, the young single mother found in a park. The results were conclusive. Ronald Bishop's DNA matched the evidence. It was the first solid link connected him directly to one of the murders, confirming long-held suspicions that he had been the perpetrator. This discovery shocked investigators. They immediately reopened other cases and tested additional DNA samples. Over the next few years, DNA evidence connected Bishop to multiple victims, confirming the pattern of strangulation and isolated body disposal. The evidence, once elusive, now painted a chilling portrait of a man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. And yet, Bishop refused to admit guilt. When confronted, he maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no involvement with any of the victims. His denial was consistent with his history, manipulative, evasive, and confident that the system had failed him once, it could fail him again. But this time, the weight of scientific evidence was overwhelming. The story of Ronald Bishop is a haunting reminder of how vulnerable women can be overlooked, how systemic failures can allow predators to persist, and how justice can be delayed for decades. It underscores the importance of vigilance, bias-free investigations, and the relentless pursuit of truth, even when the perpetrator appears ordinary, even friendly, even trustworthy. By the mid-1980s, Ronald Bishop had refined his methods, choosing victims with precision and disposing of their bodies in locations that offered both concealment and a low risk of discovery. He had learned from his earlier crimes that law enforcement and society often overlooked women on the fringes: runaways, sex workers, women struggling with addiction, and those living transient lives. These women, already marginalized, became invisible to the world, and Bishop exploited that invisibility with chilling efficiency. In March of 1987, 20-year-old Kelly A. Ford disappeared after leaving her part-time job at a local diner on the north side of Indianapolis. She had been working to save money for college and was generally cautious, avoiding dangerous neighborhoods. But that caution could not protect her from Bishop, who had been observing patterns of young women who moved through the city's urban areas alone. Her body was found in a wooded lot on the outskirts of town, face down, shoelaces tied around her neck. Like the others, she had been strangled and clearly fought for her life. A few months later, in July 1987, 19-year-old Angela Mayfield, a student and part-time waitress, was discovered in a shallow ditch near an abandoned factory. Her body had been stripped, leaving only her socks and undergarments, and a nylon stocking was tied tightly around her neck. Investigators noted the similarity to prior unsolved cases, but without forensic evidence, the connection remained speculative. Bishop's careful attention to detail had ensured that there were few witnesses and little physical evidence that could tie him to the scene, at least at the time. November of the same year brought yet another victim, 36-year-old Shyla Ingram. Shyla had struggled with employment instability and was living in a small studio apartment downtown. On the night of her disappearance, she had left her building to buy groceries. Her body was discovered hours later inside a van parked behind an auto repair shop. Her personal items, including rings and a watch, were missing. The police noted strangulation once again as the cause of death. By now, a pattern was apparent to anyone willing to look. The victims were women, often vulnerable, all killed in a similar manner and discarded in isolated locations across Indianapolis. Shortly after Shyla's death, 30-year-old Carmeline Hibbs was found in a nearly empty parking lot. Carmeline had a history of substance abuse, but she was attempting to rebuild her life, participating in rehabilitation programs and reconnecting with estranged family members. Her death mirrored the others: strangled, abandoned, and stripped of personal items. Despite the obvious connections between these cases, law enforcement treated each one individually, failing to recognize that they were part of a larger, methodical series of crimes. The systematic nature of these murders allowed Bishop to operate with confidence. In public, he remained the friendly, dependable sanitation supervisor his neighbors had always known. He volunteered for community events, helped co-workers troubleshoot problems on the garbage routes, and maintained a steady presence in the neighborhood. This facade gave him cover, allowing him to plan and execute murders without drawing suspicion. Friends and co-workers described him as polite, generous, and helpful, a stark contrast to the predator he had become. But Bishop's personal life was turbulent. Behind closed doors, he was abusive to his wives and girlfriends. His first wife, Linda, had endured years of domestic abuse before their divorce, and his second marriage ended under similar circumstances. By the mid-1980s, Bishop had married for the third time, but that union, too, was marked by aggression and intimidation. Court records reveal multiple arrests for assault and harassment, yet he repeatedly avoided significant consequences due to witness recantations, plea deals, or lax prosecution. In 1989, the city of Indianapolis began to experience a subtle but undeniable rise in reports of missing women, particularly those on the city's margins. Yet Bishop's pattern of targeting women who were less likely to be reported missing allowed him to remain under the radar. Many cases were initially dismissed as runaways, accidental deaths, or overdoses, giving him a dangerous sense of invincibility. The 1990s brought further escalation. Helga Kruger, a 26-year-old immigrant from Germany, had moved to Indianapolis to pursue a career in healthcare. In February 1990, her body was found in a secluded park, strangled with a towel. The police noted the similarity to previous unsolved cases, but there was still insufficient evidence to make an arrest. Bishop had learned to cover his tracks meticulously. He avoided leaving fingerprints, controlled the crime scenes, and disposed of evidence in ways that frustrated investigators. By this time, a disturbing pattern had become apparent. The victim shared several traits: young age or vulnerability, minimal family oversight, and frequent exposure to urban streets or isolated areas. Many had been involved in part-time sex work or substance abuse, making their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate concern. Bishop exploited systemic gaps in law enforcement and societal biases, using his knowledge of the city to select victims who were both accessible and unlikely to be missed. In 1991, Bishop was arrested briefly for theft, a minor offense that required bail. While this might have seemed inconsequential to the public, investigators later realized it provided him with temporary cover, as he had an alibi for at least one potential crime during that period. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but not for murder, just for probation violations and property offenses. Incredibly, he had committed a series of murders before and after this incarceration, exploiting his temporary absence to manipulate public perception of his law-abiding behavior. During this period, Bishop also married for a fourth time. Despite his record, he managed to convince another woman that he was trustworthy, charming, and capable of stability. He maintained his public persona, carefully crafting an image that concealed decades of violence. To neighbors, co-workers, and friends, he was unremarkable, a hard-working man with a steady job and a seemingly ordinary life. The failure of the justice system was stark. From the late 1970s through the early 1990s, Bishop had been arrested numerous times for assault, sexual assault, and harassment. In every instance, he received minimal consequences: fines, probation, or dropped charges. Witnesses, many of whom were marginalized themselves, often recanted statements due to fear, intimidation, or social pressures. Each failed case reinforced his belief that he could continue without facing serious repercussions. By the mid-1990s, Bishop's crimes seemed to cease, or at least went unreported. There were no known murders linked to him between 1993 and 1995. Friends and co-workers began speaking about him positively, as if the past had never happened. But beneath this calm, investigators had begun to notice the long-term pattern of unresolved murders. Retired detectives and case files were reviewed periodically, but limited technology at the time had made it impossible to connect DNA samples from the crime scenes. It wasn't until 2001, when the Indianapolis Police Department received federal funding to review cold cases using modern DNA analysis, that investigators could finally build a scientific case against him. Samples collected decades earlier were now being tested with technology unavailable during the initial investigations. A blood sample collected from Naomi Kelly's 1986 murder scene was analyzed and compared to national DNA databases. The result was conclusive. Ronald Bishop was present at the scene of one of the murders. The revelation stunned investigators. They immediately reopened other cold cases, testing DNA from victims Janice Harper, Tamara Clayton, and Margaret Daniels. The results consistently linked him to multiple murders, confirming suspicions that he had been the perpetrator for years. The patterns became undeniable. Each victim had been strangled, left in isolated locations, and had connections to urban streets or transient lifestyles. The renewed investigations also highlighted Bishop's audacity. During the 1980s and early 1990s, he had not only continued killing, but had done so with impunity, manipulating witnesses and avoiding scrutiny from law enforcement. The gaps in the system, coupled with biases against his victims, allowed him to operate in plain sight, moving freely through the city while leaving a trail of violence that went largely unnoticed. With DNA evidence in hand, the police finally had the tools to confront him. Witnesses who had once feared speaking up were encouraged to come forward. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed Bishop's movements over decades, connecting him to multiple crime scenes and consolidating the evidence that had been scattered over years. It was a painstaking process, but it painted a clear portrait. A man who had spent decades hiding behind a facade of normalcy while systematically preying on women society had largely forgotten. By 2005, Ronald Bishop was firmly on law enforcement's radar. The combination of DNA evidence, eyewitness statements, and forensic analysis finally allowed authorities to pursue charges in multiple murder cases simultaneously. While he continued to deny involvement, the overwhelming weight of evidence made it impossible for him to evade prosecution as he had in the past. By 2006, the mounting evidence against Ronald Bishop was impossible to ignore. The Indianapolis Police Department, with the benefit of decades of forensic advancements, had linked him through DNA to at least 6 murders spanning from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. What had once been a collection of disconnected, unsolved cases was now unmistakably tied together by a single perpetrator. Bishop, a man who had lived a seemingly ordinary life, was finally facing the consequences of decades of terror. In early 2006, detectives obtained a court-approved warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample from Bishop. At first, he appeared calm, almost smug, as if he still believed that the decades of denial and the system's earlier failures would shield him. But when his DNA matched samples from multiple crime scenes, the facade began to crack. It was undeniable. Bishop had been present at the murders of Kelly Ford, Angela Mayfield, Shalia Ingram, and several others. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a predator who had carefully, methodically selected and killed his victims over years, leaving only the faintest traces behind. The arrest in March of 2006 sent shockwaves through Indianapolis. Neighbors who had once praised him as a hard-working sanitation supervisor and reliable family man could scarcely reconcile this image with the brutal reality. Coworkers, friends, and even distant relatives were stunned, struggling to understand how someone so seemingly ordinary could commit such calculated acts of violence. Local media initially struggled to cover the story without sensationalizing it, but as details emerged, the horrifying truth became clear. Bishop had spent decades killing women while hiding in plain sight. The trial, which began in 2007, was as much a reckoning for the city as it was for Bishop. Prosecutors meticulously detailed his history of assaults, domestic violence, and prior arrests, showing a clear pattern of behavior that escalated to murder. Witnesses who had once been ignored were finally allowed to testify, recounting incidents that, in hindsight, were pieces of a larger puzzle. Each account added another layer to the case, demonstrating Bishop's consistent pattern of selecting vulnerable women, assaulting them, and disposing of their bodies in isolated locations. A pivotal moment in the trial came when the prosecution presented the DNA evidence. Samples taken from victims spanning nearly 3 decades were conclusively matched to Bishop. This forensic link left no room for doubt. The man who had walked free after multiple assaults, harassment claims, and even attempted sexual assault was the same man responsible for a string of brutal murders. The defense attempted to cast doubt, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial or contaminated, but the court's expert witnesses dismantled these claims. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the trial was Bishop's own demeanor. Even when confronted with irrefutable evidence, he refused to admit guilt. In interviews and in court, he claimed he had never met the victims, that the DNA results were flawed, and that he was being persecuted unfairly. This unwavering denial, despite overwhelming evidence, reflected the same arrogance that had allowed him to evade justice for decades. Psychologists later noted that his ability to compartmentalize, maintaining a public persona while committing heinous crimes, was a key factor in his prolonged evasion of the law. The prosecution also highlighted the social factors that enabled Bishop. Many of his victims had been marginalized women, sex workers, runaways, women struggling with mental illness or addiction. Their disappearances often went unnoticed, and law enforcement had historically given lower priority to their cases. Bishop exploited this bias, choosing victims whose absence would not immediately trigger widespread concern. In doing so, he revealed a disturbing reality. Killers who prey on society's most vulnerable often escape detection far longer than those targeting more visible or affluent individuals. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Bishop's trial was not without procedural challenges. Decades had passed since the murders, and some physical evidence had degraded or been misplaced. Witness memories had faded, and some initial investigative records were incomplete. However, the advent of modern forensic techniques, particularly DNA profiling, bridged these gaps, providing the scientific certainty that had been lacking during the original investigations. On March 17, 2007, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict. Ronald Bishop was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. Each count carried a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. While the convictions did not encompass every suspected murder, they represented justice for the victims whose families had waited decades for closure. Families of the victims, many of whom had spent years pleading for attention and investigation, finally had a measure of vindication. Following the verdict, law enforcement continued to examine cold cases in an effort to link Bishop to additional crimes. Investigators suspected that his actual number of victims could be significantly higher, potentially reaching double digits. Though Bishop was never charged with every suspected murder, patterns in his crimes, strangulation, isolated disposal sites, targeting vulnerable women, strongly suggested that the 6 convictions were only part of a much larger spree. Public reaction to the case was intense. Media outlets covered the trial extensively, highlighting the failures of the justice system that had allowed Bishop to operate unchecked for decades. Social commentary focused on systemic issues, how marginalized victims were often ignored, how repeat offenders could evade prosecution through technicalities, and how forensic advancements were crucial in resolving cases that had long gone cold. Bishop became emblematic of both criminal cunning and systemic oversight, a personification of failures in law enforcement that allowed a serial killer to persist. Even in prison, Bishop continued to deny responsibility. Interviews conducted years later, including a high-profile televised confrontation in 2018, revealed his continued refusal to admit guilt. When asked directly if he had murdered the women he was convicted of killing, he refused to answer, often storming out of interviews or dismissing the questions entirely. His behavior reinforced the enduring horror of his crimes, a man capable of decades-long murder and manipulation, still living in denial even behind bars. The legacy of Bishop's crimes extends beyond the courtroom. They serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in law enforcement, the role of forensic science in achieving justice, and the need to protect society's most vulnerable. Victims who were once overlooked are now remembered, their stories finally told in full. Advocacy groups for missing and exploited women have cited Bishop's case as a pivotal example of why systemic change is necessary, why biases in policing and societal indifference can have deadly consequences. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was bittersweet. Conviction did not undo the trauma or the years of unanswered questions, but it did provide recognition of the truth. Memorials were held, and community efforts ensured that the women would not be forgotten. Survivors of Bishop's assaults and acquaintances of his victims found solace in the knowledge that the man responsible was no longer free to harm others. Even decades later, law enforcement continues to study Bishop's methods. Behavioral analysts and criminologists have cited him as a case study in both predatory behavior and investigative oversight. His ability to maintain a normal outward appearance while committing serial murders illustrates the dangers posed by offenders who hide in plain sight. The case has also influenced protocols for investigating crimes against marginalized populations, emphasizing that no victim's disappearance should be treated as less urgent or less serious. In reflecting on Bishop's case, it becomes clear that a combination of factors allowed his crimes to persist. Societal biases against vulnerable women, repeated failures of the justice system to act on earlier assaults, and Bishop's own meticulous methods of covering his tracks. It is a stark illustration of how systemic oversight can amplify the reach of a predator. And yet, it is also a testament to the power of persistence, forensic science, and advocacy who refuse to let victims disappear into obscurity. In the end, while Bishop may continue to deny his guilt, the truth stands firmly established. He was a predator, a manipulator, and a murderer who finally faced the consequences of his decades-long spree. The story of Ronald Bishop leaves a haunting lesson. Vigilance, advocacy, and science are essential tools in ensuring that the most vulnerable are protected, that justice can prevail, and that the names of victims are never forgotten. In remembering them, society confronts its own failures, confronts the darkness that lurks in seemingly ordinary lives, and reaffirms its commitment to never let such horrors go unanswered. People like to believe that danger announces itself, that it comes with warning signs, raised voices, or shadows creeping through the dark. But sometimes the most dangerous threat is already inside the house, sitting at the same table, sharing the same last name. On the night of December 3, 2002, a quiet neighborhood in Hawthorne, Georgia, was shattered by a single emergency call. Just after midnight, a neighbor reported seeing flames pouring from the windows of a modest rental home on Oak Ridge Lane. Fire crews arrived expecting the usual possibilities: a faulty heater, an unattended candle, maybe someone trapped inside trying to escape. What they found instead would haunt the town for years. Inside the smoke-filled living room lay the body of Marcus Holloway, a 42-year-old single father. He was sprawled near his recliner, unresponsive. At first glance, it looked like he had been overcome by smoke, but as firefighters moved closer, it became clear the fire was not the cause of his death. Marcus had suffered catastrophic blunt force injuries to the head. The fire had been set after he was already dead. And then came the realization that shifted the case from tragic to terrifying. Marcus's two sons, Evan, 14, and Noah, 12, were missing. In the early hours, law enforcement believed they might be victims. Maybe they had escaped the fire. Maybe someone had taken them. A statewide alert went out, and officers canvassed nearby woods and roads. The town held its breath, clinging to the hope that the boys were safe. That hope would not last long. By sunrise, officers located Evan and Noah walking along a service road less than 2 miles from the burned house. They were calm, too calm. There were no tears, no panic, no confusion. When questioned, they did not ask about their father. Instead, they told detectives exactly what had happened. They said they killed him. According to their initial statement, the boys had waited until Marcus fell asleep in his recliner. Evan picked up a metal bat from the garage. Noah stood nearby. They struck their father repeatedly. Afterward, they poured lighter fluid and set the house on fire before leaving on foot. The confession stunned everyone who heard it. 2 middle school boys, a planned killing, no immediate remorse. At first, their explanation was simple. They said their father was too strict, too controlling, too harsh. He enforced rules, punished them when they broke them, limited where they could go and who they could see. They said they felt trapped. But almost immediately, investigators sensed something wasn't right. The boys spoke in rehearsed phrases. Their stories were oddly polished. And then, within hours, the narrative began to change. They said they hadn't acted alone. A new name entered the investigation: Caleb Rains, a 41-year-old man who lived a few blocks away. According to the boys, Caleb had been a family friend, someone they trusted, someone who understood them in ways their father never did. They now claimed that Caleb had encouraged them, that he had convinced them their father was dangerous, that life would be better without him. They said after the killing, they ran to Caleb's house where he washed their clothes and told them what to say if police asked questions. Then the story shifted again. This time, Evan and Noah insisted they hadn't killed their father at all. They said Caleb had done it, that he had beaten Marcus to death while they waited outside, that he had forced them to take the blame. Each version contradicted the last. And then something far darker emerged. During a private interview with a child psychologist, Noah revealed details that changed the entire tone of the case. He said his relationship with Caleb was not just friendly. He said Caleb had convinced them they were in love, that what they shared was special, that Marcus was the only thing standing in the way of their future together. Investigators were now faced with a horrifying question. Were these boys calculating killers, or were they victims of manipulation by an adult predator? To understand how everything unraveled so catastrophically, investigators had to go back years, long before the fire. Marcus Holloway was born and raised in Georgia. He met Linda Brewer in his early 20s, and the two quickly started a life together. Their sons were born just 14 months apart. Money was always tight, and the relationship was strained, but Marcus worked multiple jobs and tried to keep the family afloat. When the boys were toddlers, the relationship collapsed. Linda left the household and eventually moved out of state. Marcus was left to raise Evan and Noah alone. For a while, he managed, barely. Overwhelmed and desperate, Marcus sought help through a faith-based family assistance program that promised temporary housing and support. The program encouraged parents to place children with foster families, assuring them it would be short-term and that reunification would remain the goal. Trusting the system, Marcus agreed. What followed fractured the family beyond repair. The program shut down less than a year later due to funding issues. Evan and Noah were separated and placed with different families in different counties. Contact between them was limited. Noah struggled intensely. He cried constantly. He refused to bond with his foster parents. Eventually, they asked for him to be removed. He was sent back to Marcus, clinging to his father as if terrified of losing him again. Evan's experience was different. He grew increasingly defiant in foster care. By his early teens, his foster parents said they could no longer handle him. He was sent back to Marcus as well. For a brief moment, it seemed like the family had a second chance. Marcus found steady work and rented a small home in Hawthorne. The boys enrolled in middle school and did well academically. Teachers described them as quiet but intelligent. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Marcus ruled the household strictly. Curfews were enforced, electronics were limited, friends were scrutinized. To Marcus, discipline meant protection. To his sons, it felt like a prison. And that's when Caleb Raines entered their lives. Caleb was the kind of adult other kids gravitated towards. His house was always open. There were video games, junk food, no questions asked. Parents in the neighborhood saw him as harmless, helpful. Marcus did not. He didn't know about Caleb's criminal past. He didn't know about the rumors that followed him quietly through town. All he knew was that his sons were spending too much time there, and when they came home, they were different, more defiant, more distant. Marcus tried to put a stop to it. The boys ran away for the first time in late November. Marcus reported them missing, begged police to take it seriously, even contacted local media. Days later, Evan was found wandering near a wooded area. Noah returned home the next day. Neighbors later reported seeing Marcus and his sons together that evening. They appeared calm, normal. It was the last time anyone would see Marcus alive. That night, the house burned, and the truth, whatever it was, burned with it. The search for the boys dragged on for more than a week, and with each passing day, the unease in Oak Hollow, Georgia, grew heavier. For Mark Caldwell, the worry was constant and consuming. He barely slept, pacing the small rental house he had worked so hard to secure after years of instability. He told police the same thing, over and over. His sons would not just run away and stay gone. Ethan and Lucas were complicated, yes, but they were still his boys. Mark took his fears public when he felt law enforcement was moving too slowly. He stood in front of local news cameras, his voice tight and tired, asking anyone who might have seen the boys to come forward. He described Ethan, 14, tall for his age and sharp-tongued, and Lucas, 13, quieter, more sensitive, rarely far from his older brother's shadow. Neighbors recognized them immediately. The brothers were well known in the area, riding bikes, hanging around convenience stores, drifting between school and home with a restless energy that never seemed to settle. Then, on November 24, 2001, there was a break. Ethan was spotted near a wooded area outside the neighboring town of Pine Ridge. He appeared disoriented but unharmed. When officers approached him, he did not resist. He asked only one question: where was his brother? The next day, Lucas returned on his own, walking back to the house as if nothing had happened. Neighbors watched as the three reunited briefly in the driveway. From the outside, it looked like the worst was over. That night, the Caldwells visited a friend a few miles away. According to later statements, the mood was tense but uneventful. No shouting, no obvious conflict, just a father trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy after days of fear. When they returned home, the lights went off as usual. Oak Hollow settled into silence. Hours later, that silence was shattered. A fire broke out just before midnight. Flames climbed quickly, visible from the road. When firefighters arrived, they expected to find a tragic accident, maybe faulty wiring or a space heater left too close to furniture. What they found instead changed everything. Mark Caldwell was dead. The fire, investigators soon realized, had not been the cause. It had been staged, deliberately set after the fact. The true cause of death was blunt force trauma. The house fire had been an attempt to erase what happened inside those walls. And just like that, the search for missing boys turned into a homicide investigation. Ethan and Lucas were found a short distance away near a man's house on the edge of town. His name was Raymond Cole. To most people, he was just Ray, a man in his early 40s with a reputation for letting kids hang out at his place. Video games, junk food, no rules. Parents whispered about him, but nothing ever seemed solid enough to stick. When police questioned the brothers, their reaction was unsettling. There were no tears, no panic, no confusion. They confessed. They said they had killed their father. According to their initial statement, Mark had fallen asleep in his recliner. Ethan picked up a metal bat from the garage. Lucas stood nearby. The attack was quick, they said, planned. Afterwards, they poured accelerant and lit the fire. Then they left. The motives sounded almost trivial. They claimed Mark was too strict, too controlling, too angry. He enforced rules they hated, took away privileges, refused to let them live the way they wanted. It was a story that felt thin even to seasoned investigators. Within hours, the story changed. Now the boys said they had help. Ray Cole had been involved. He had encouraged them. He had promised them freedom, a better life, a home without punishment or fear. After the killing, they said Ray had taken them in, washed their clothes, told them what to say if anyone asked questions. Then the story shifted again. Suddenly, they claimed Ray had done it himself. He killed Mark. They were forced to go along with it. Each version contradicted the last, and the more they talked, the more complicated the case became. Investigators began digging into Ray Cole's background. What they found was deeply troubling. Ray had a criminal record that stretched back years. None of it included homicide, but there were charges involving minors, substances, and violations that suggested a pattern of boundary-crossing behavior. Several parents had complained about how close he seemed with neighborhood kids, but no one had ever been able to make anything stick. He was careful, calculated. Then came the revelation that changed the tone of the case entirely. Lucas told detectives that his relationship with Ray was not just friendly. He said Ray had convinced him they were in love, that what they shared was special, private, something no one else would understand. The language Lucas used sounded rehearsed, almost adult. Investigators recognized it immediately for what it was: grooming. They searched Ray's home. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Letters, notes, messages written by Ray to Lucas filled with affection and promises. Pages from Lucas's own notebook describing his devotion to Ray and his resentment towards his father. It was clear that Mark Caldwell had stood between his son and the man who had positioned himself as Lucas's savior. The prosecution now faced a tangled web: 2 minors accused of killing their father, a grown man with an inappropriate relationship with one of them, confessions that shifted with each retelling, and a public that could not decide whether to see the boys as monsters or victims. Ray Cole was arrested and charged first. At trial, Lucas testified that on the night of the murder, Ray had come into the house while Mark slept. He claimed Ray told the boys to wait outside, that they never saw the attack. Only afterwards did Ray explain that Mark was gone and that it had been necessary. According to Lucas, Ray said their father would never allow them to be together and would destroy their lives if given the chance. Ethan backed up parts of the story, though his testimony was less emotional, more restrained. He spoke of promises Ray made, of a life without rules, of being understood for the first time. The defense tore into the boys' earlier confessions. They highlighted the graphic details the brothers had provided initially, details that suggested first-hand involvement. How could they know so much if they weren't there? How could they describe the scene so accurately if they were waiting outside? The jury listened, watched, weighed every word. Ray Cole was acquitted. The decision stunned the community. Many believed the evidence against him was overwhelming, but doubt lingered, and in a criminal trial, doubt is enough. With Ray cleared, attention turned back to Ethan and Lucas. This time they were not witnesses, they were defendants. They sat at the defense table and pressed shirts that made them look younger than they were, still children really. The prosecution argued that Ethan had been the driving force, fueled by anger and resentment, that Lucas, deeply entangled in his emotional dependence on Ray, had followed along. Together, they carried out the attack and then tried to blame an adult when reality closed in. The letters were introduced as evidence, so were the diary entries. The prosecution did not deny Ray's influence. They argued that influence did not erase responsibility. The defense painted a different picture. Two neglected boys, a fractured childhood, a manipulative adult who exploited their vulnerabilities and turned them against the one person trying to hold their lives together. They argued that the justice system was failing to see the full scope of abuse. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Ethan and Lucas Caldwell were found guilty of second-degree murder and arson. The judge, acknowledging their age and the unusual circumstances, sentenced them to juvenile detention rather than adult prison. It was a compromise that satisfied almost no one. Too lenient, some said. Too harsh, others argued. In the months that followed, public opinion fractured. Books were proposed, documentaries planned, talk shows debated whether the boys were criminals or victims. Years later, their story would still be argued, dissected, and revisited. But at that moment, as they were led out of the courtroom, the truth was simpler and far more painful. A family was gone, a childhood was shattered, and whatever really happened in that house in Oak Hollow, nothing would ever put it back together again. Years passed, but the Caldwell case never truly faded from Oak Hollow's collective memory. It lingered in conversations at diners, resurfaced in online forums, and returned every few years when a new documentary or podcast revisited the story. What made it so enduring was not just the brutality of the crime, but the unanswered question at its core. Who was truly responsible, and how much of the truth had ever been told? Ethan and Lucas were sent to separate juvenile facilities shortly after sentencing. Officials claimed the separation was for their own psychological well-being, but many believed it was also strategic. Together, they had always presented a united front, even when their stories conflicted. Apart, investigators hoped cracks might form. At first, neither boy spoke much. Ethan kept to himself, earning a reputation as distant and guarded. Therapists noted his refusal to discuss the night of the fire in detail. When pressed, he would repeat the same lines, that it was over, that nothing could change it now. He focused instead on routine, on physical exercise, on anything that kept his mind occupied. Lucas, on the other hand, unraveled. Separated from Ray Cole, separated from his brother, and stripped of the fantasy he had clung to, Lucas spiraled. Counseling notes later obtained through public records described intense guilt, confusion, and emotional dependency issues. He wrote letters that were never sent, many addressed to Ray, others to his father. In some, he apologized. In others, he blamed everyone but himself. 2 years into his sentence, Lucas finally talked. In a closed therapy session that would later become part of a sealed court document, Lucas admitted that his earlier testimony had not been entirely truthful. He said Ray had not physically attacked his father. That part, he claimed, had been a lie born from fear and loyalty. But he also insisted that Ray had not been innocent either. According to Lucas, the idea had come from Ray. Not directly, not as an order, but as something planted slowly over time. Ray spoke often about Mark as an obstacle, a man who would eventually take everything away. He talked about how some people deserved consequences. He framed rebellion as bravery and violence as inevitability. By the time the night arrived, Lucas said, the act felt less like a crime and more like a conclusion. When therapists asked whether Ethan had led the attack, Lucas hesitated. He said Ethan had been angry, yes, but unsure. That it was Lucas who pushed forward, desperate to prove something, desperate to protect the relationship he believed defined him. This confession never reached a courtroom. By the time authorities reviewed the document, Lucas was already nearing the end of his juvenile sentence. Prosecutors debated reopening aspects of the case, but without physical evidence or a legal path forward, they chose not to act. The confession was archived, another layer of truth buried. Ethan was released first. At 21, he stepped back into the world under a new name, part of a legal agreement designed to help former juveniles reintegrate. He moved several states away, avoided media, and cut contact with almost everyone from Oak Hollow. For years, no one heard from him. Lucas was released 18 months later. Unlike his brother, he stayed close to home. He enrolled in community college, changed his appearance, and volunteered with youth outreach programs. Some saw this as redemption, others saw it as unsettling. A few parents quietly pulled their children away when they learned who he was. Ray Cole also disappeared from public view. After his acquittal, he moved frequently, leaving behind short leases and little trace. Civil lawsuits were filed against him by relatives of Mark Caldwell, but they went nowhere. Without a criminal conviction, there was little leverage. He remained, in the eyes of the law, a free man. Then, nearly a decade after the fire, something unexpected happened. A former inmate from the same juvenile facility as Ethan came forward with a statement. He claimed Ethan had once confessed during a late-night conversation in the common area. According to him, Ethan said Ray had been present that night, that he watched, that he didn't swing the bat, but he didn't stop it either, that when the fire was lit, Ray stood in the doorway and nodded. The statement was vague, unverifiable, but it reignited interest. A cold case unit reviewed the file. Old evidence was re-examined with modern forensic techniques. Fire patterns were analyzed again, blood spatter reports revisited. Nothing definitive emerged, but questions grew louder. Why had Ray washed the boys' clothes? Why had accelerant been stored in a place the boys claimed not to know about? Why had neighbors reported Ray's car near the Caldwell house that night, a detail dismissed years earlier as unreliable? Despite the renewed scrutiny, no charges were filed. Mark Caldwell's death remained legally closed, but morally unresolved. The public remained divided. Some believed Ethan and Lucas had acted alone, fueled by adolescent rage and manipulation, but still fully responsible. Others believed Ray Cole had orchestrated the entire thing and escaped accountability by exploiting legal gray areas and the unreliable nature of juvenile testimony. Documentaries leaned into the ambiguity. Podcasts dissected every contradiction. Armchair detectives built timelines and motive charts that filled entire forms. Each theory found an audience. What never changed was the impact. Oak Hollow never quite recovered from the case. Parents became more cautious, trust eroded. The unspoken rule that children were safe wandering the neighborhood at dusk quietly vanished. Ray's old house stood empty for years, a physical reminder of something no one wanted to name. As for the brothers, their paths never crossed again. Ethan reportedly built a quiet life, working manual jobs, avoiding attention. He never gave an interview. Those who claimed to know him described a man who carried his past heavily, but privately. Lucas, years later, agreed to speak anonymously with a journalist. He did not name names, he did not offer closure, but he said one thing that stayed with readers. He said that when you are young, you don't always understand where your thoughts come from, that ideas can feel like your own even when they are planted by someone else, that by the time you realize the difference, it is often too late. He said he thinks about his father every day, not the night of the fire, but the ordinary moments before, the rules, the arguments, the structure he once hated. He said he wonders now if those things were protection all along. Ray Cole was last rumored to be living under another name in a coastal town hundreds of miles away. No one has confirmed it. No one has proven it. And so the Caldwell case remains what it has always been, a story without a clean ending, a crime shaped by manipulation, adolescence, and silence. A reminder that sometimes the truth is not lost because no one knows it, but because it is too fractured to ever fully hold.